We're up and running. Good morning. Welcome to NycosRPG, and this is Game Master's Toolbox, and I am doing something crazy. It's a very merry on birthday to you if you know the reference. Cool. I want to give you a gift, and this gift I'm going to give you is something that was going to change your table forever. I'm Jonathan Albin, a Game Master with 50 years of experience, and today I want to offer you a indispensable resource, a tool that I use all of the time. As a matter of fact, I did it so often and so regularly, I didn't even realize what the gift was. And now that I have it, it's yours. Let's get started. Before that, if you haven't yet, go down below, click all the buttons so the algorithm knows that you're part of our audience, and let's go to it. Alrighty, so you're at your table. It's a regular weeknight. Your players are all there with bated breath. You begin to distill the narrative and share with them the details, and all of a sudden they ask you a question, or two, or three, and pretty soon you are completely overwhelmed. You're looking through all of your documentation, you're looking for the stats they're wanting, and it's driving you crazy. So what I came up with, what I found was useful, and what I thought I should share with you is something I call a TableTome. The word kind of carries the meaning that I intend. A TableTome is a single document, a sheet of paper, really, that has on it all the materials you're going to need to access during the session. All in one place, all in one location. As I recall, when I was a youngster and we were using the Player's Handbook and the Dungeon Master's Guide and the Monster Manual to try to calculate everything, there were charts and there were graphs and there were numbers everywhere, and it was difficult to remember which page. It got to the point where you either memorized them, flagged them, or some other way marked them so you could find them again. And for decades, that was the process. And every time there was a conflict or a question or a confusion, we had to go grab the documentation and fumble through the pages, and it was a burden and it was a problem. Well, eventually, and this is decades ago, I decided that I should put all this information down in a single location. Well, other players did the same thing, and of course the other players developed the concept of the Game Master screen. That became the ubiquitous tool for this process. So what I'm offering is just merely an alternative to the GM screen. As a GM, I play open face, which means I play with all my tabletop revealed in front of me. There's a long story of player treachery that led to this, and I'm sure I'll tell the tale at some point. But the issue is that we came up with this one tool, and I've made it available to you through our website. Now, I'm not at our usual website right now. We're doing some reorganizing, and so I've listed in here on the screen the website, and I'll put a link below, or I'll attempt to put a link below. I haven't figured out how to put links in the description yet, but I will put at least the text, hypertext there for you, so you can get to our website. And when you go to our website, I should go ahead and represent that real quickly. Yeah. Let's go back here. All right. Back one more. All right. So if you go to the website that's listed here, you'll see that there are a lot of sections. And although it looks plain and mundane, when you start looking at and hovering over the different locations that you might go to from the website, they change colors and stuff. But we're going to be looking in particular at this one right here, the free stuff, the Play Now button. So we're going to click on that, and that's going to take us to our tools page. And here are 4 different things we're going to be using as fast play tools that are just instant access to you. So we're going to go ahead and just click on the one here that's settings and structure, the setting structure sheet. Oh no, it went to the wrong place. Yikes, that's not good. It was there just a minute ago. Hell, there we go. There we go. And so we'll go to the top of it. So the master book sheet here, the TableTome Resource, has everything you're going to need literally anything that's going to be accessible to your players in adventure in terms of numbers they're going to need. And I've put it all in a single document to make it easier. But we're going to be going through it bit by bit, step by step, to show you how to use it. So if you need to stop the video now to go and download it, like I said, I'll leave the link below for you so you can access it through YouTube. But once you're set up, we're going to go to... Alrighty, so now we're going to be talking about the document form. And although it's an empty space on the page, and it is perhaps one of the more daunting tasks, it would be to determine what you want to name your setting. And in this case, the idea of the form, or whatever, is established to set up a general play area that you then can modify specifically to what your adventures require. But in this case, you would want to name your setting something. So here on the form, you'll notice that right here at the top, there's a place for the setting right here in the center. I'll highlight it, mark it out. So the setting name will go up here. And while it may not seem like much, the actual benefit is in the long term, your players will remember your adventure, and you want them to remember it by something. And so by giving them a setting name, they can say, you know, something along the line of, do you remember when we were at Radiator Springs, for example, or Metropolis, or whatever? You can use any name you need for the players to be able to hang their memories on a location. That makes it easier for them to refer to and talk about this setting from session to session. My groups all have memorized the city names in the world of Nykos that they visited, and often will do backtrack episodes or other ways of getting from city to city, utilizing the names. So the next thing we're going to talk about are descriptive values. Now, I utilize this term because it covers a lot of ground. Not only does it cover the aesthetics of a location, but it also covers the cultural limitation or isolation that they might experience. Oh dear. Did I close my window? I don't think I closed my window. There it is. I hope that didn't change things. We'll fix that in a second. And of course, I'll be clipping this in post-production. But when you are in this descriptive values portion, what you're going to be looking at is probability of something. In the number of years I've run, there have been plenty of opportunities to use random charts and random encounters and such. And the idea of the descriptive values is it gives you reasons for things in particular to happen within your adventure. So let me pull it up and I'll show you. All right. So when we're looking at, for example, the aesthetic appeal of the location, the cultural isolation, material wealth, self-sufficiency, sophistication, all of these terms are really just triggers for your own purpose, so that you will think about what the place looks like, what it feels like, how the people in the town treat each other. Are they separate from other cultures, or are they, well connected? And these spaces are for putting in percentage numbers. Now, as I've mentioned before, the concept of the NycosRPG resource is always in percentage values. So you would create for yourself a method for using this, or you can use the Nykos ramping process to generate these numbers. And when you create them randomly, this is generally not for your usual and established long-term campaign, but for a new location or a place that they've moved to that you haven't yet mapped. The idea of having these numbers gives you a way to answer questions when the players ask, In particular, you can answer the questions that they're asking for generally in a specific way. So, for example, they come into town and they want to know what's the likelihood the locals will report their appearance to authorities from other places. You know, adventurers do have predilection for issues of quite often crime and heists and such. And by knowing whether or not this locality is culturally isolated and rarely going to report, you could have that number determined here by a percentage die roll. And all of these numbers are subject to the storyteller's preferences. So if you want it to be aesthetically appealing locations have high values, so be it. If you decide they want to have your aesthetic appeal be a low value, so be it. But once you've determined that, then you have a die rolling mechanism to determine whether or not it's a success or a fail. If you go further and utilize QDR, the quantum die rolling, then of course the graduated scale gives you a much stronger understanding of what these numbers might mean. But let's say you've got a material wealth of 35%. If you want to know if there's anybody that would be of a moderate to higher estate, even before we've rolled for the cultural variation or the economic strata, you can see whether or not there's the possibility for a relatively high material wealth by the number in that space. Self-sufficiency is, again, a determinant of how well the local community can handle their own business and not interfere with each other. And their sophistication is dealing with their cultural connection with the rest of the world. If they are a backwards people and keep to themselves, then you'd have a high self-sufficiency and a relatively low sophistication. And then trade relevance is, of course, determined by whether or not they actively communicate with people from the outside world, from other locales that are not this location. So trade relevance might be particularly high if it's on a trade route, for example. Okay, so next thing we're going to talk about are accessibility factors. And this is one of those situations, and matter of fact, this entire tome mechanism is set up so that the shotgun blast of many questions can be answered by just simply determining which portion of the tome applies and then utilizing the numerics from that situation. So, for example, if somebody comes into town and says, I need to have a blacksmith look at my pony, I've thrown a shoe or something, then your accessibility factors will tell you what the likelihood of finding somebody in that occupation in this community. So let's take a look at that. So over here on the accessibility factors, you'll see a location type, relative position, means of access, population density, social integration, and xenoaggression. I'll explain this. First of all, xeno probably is a knee-jerk reaction from everybody that plays video games, but or has watched a Aliens movie. But each of these terms refer to something that you would be looking for. So a location type, to look for a blacksmith, you can literally put down any accessibility location and utilize the same number, or you can actually look for a specific type of location. So let's say you've written the adventure to be a haunted house, then the location type for your haunted house would be, say, 75% likely they'll find it right away. And then relative position is comparing this locale with ones that they might be familiar with. So if they say, oh, have I been to this city, or am I aware of it, you could roll against relative position to know whether or not this is perhaps familiar to them in terms of knowing the names, or whether this is a wholly new experience. Means of access is referring to the types of travel that might be available. So Is there a stagecoach? Is there mail service? These kind of things provide a numeric value for your players to be able to find out things about the community. Population density, this is something that you as a game master will find useful if they're looking for a particular person. What's the likelihood that the person would be known to the others? If it's the term here doesn't necessarily mean you have a high population. It means that the number of people per square mile or whatever is high or low. And therefore, what is the likelihood they've actually run into the individual that the players are looking for? Social integration is sounds like a futuristic term, but the social integration is really referring to how well they know each other's business. If Bobby is expecting a shipment and you're delivering to Bobby, the likelihood of the individuals in town knowing where to find Bobby or what even this might be about would be a factor of their integration. And then finally, xenoaggression is merely how this community, how the people or the creatures in this area react to strangers, to those who are not known to them. And so if there's a relatively high xenoaggression, they're not going to answer questions favorably if you come in asking them. So that's the basic round out here. These numbers give the players, they give you as the game master quick access to the answers to the questions players are asking without necessarily having to have drawn out a map or memorized every page of your adventure. Just simply come look at these numbers and answer the questions on the fly. So let's move on. All right, so next we're going to talk about scenes and stages. Now this document is a settings level document, which means this is your establishing shot. You're telling the players what's in the general area. You're not necessarily drilling down to what they came to look for, but you're instead describing the locale. So therefore there might be several particular scenes that you are hoping to play out or expect the players to look into. For example, the very idea of looking for that blacksmith I mentioned before, there might be a blacksmith scene. Perhaps the adventure requires a certain number of things to occur before the local community really does react to the individual based on their social integration score or whatever you might have determined that it's going to take. Introduction, and then a rough contact, and then narrow it down and write these into separate stages. And this section is simply to create a reminder list for you what those triggers are, so that as the players move through the story, you're able to keep up with them and stay ahead of them. So let me show you the piece of the document I'm referring to. So down here below, you'll see scenes and stages, and the scenes and stages area is just a place for 5 or 6 little idea notes. Each of these could be its own settings page, and if you've looked at my videos about the nesting dolls, the Matryoshka method, you would have stage 1, stage 2, stage 3 as separate entries on the form here, so that when things happen, you'd be able to know how close they are to completing the adventure. This helps you also to figure out opportune points for, say, breaking a session or setting up cliffhangers and the like. Next. All right, next we're going to talk about personalities. And there is a lot of conversation when game masters talk with each other about whether or not you build out full characters for every possible encounter, or whether you should, because some games groups go rather aggressive and want to go directly to combat with anybody they integrate with who might be a threat. And so this isn't that. The idea of having a list of personalities for your adventure is literally just sort of a touch point map for you to determine who they need to see in town before whatever action scene is intended to be played out. So this list here on the form is found right next to the settings and stages. And so it might be that they're associated. So go to the blacksmith's during this scene, and then meet with the person that takes care of the actual farrier work, because you need to talk to the horseshoe guy for some reason. So the idea here is that you can link them together, or you can use them independently, but you have both resources at your fingertips. And if you're particularly if you've written a locale that they might be visiting for some time, you can also put in your particular triggers to remind you, oh yes, this is where they'll meet that story encounter person, or this is where they'll run into the window dressing and give them the chance to see the woman in red or whatever. Now the next section are communal attributes, and the communal attributes are basically those pieces of a community that give us a bit of insight into how they collectively work, because we need to be able to know whether or not the players can, for example, rally the troops, or perhaps create a revolution. And to do that, we need to have this mechanism available. And on the sheet here, it's on page 2, and there are 3 pages to the document, the last of which we're only going to touch on very abruptly. But the idea here, the communal attributes, are talking about characteristics of the whole. Now, these are at times is difficult to understand, but if players are asking certain kinds of questions, it's nice to have an answer for them. So, for example, if they are wanting to know whether or not this town supports a local magistrate, you can say check under the concept of their ideology and decide whether or not that would be a high number or a low number. Now, I recommend you fill out all these numbers before you start, whether you use a ramp, a randomized method, or if you just pick and choose the numbers to match your community. By having a flat number to roll against, you're no longer having to flat out answer a question, but you can consider and kibitz if you need to buy yourself some time in the storytelling and process to get the words across. So yeah, let's say they're asking about the ideology, asking whether or not they appreciate the magistrate. Well, let's say your party's gone further and they've made negative comments about such a magistrate. Well, perhaps the locals actually are open to the way the magistrate works. They just didn't like a particular situation. And so they may collectively have a high responsiveness and therefore react. So you're going to mix and match these in order to answer the questions that the players have in a reasonable fashion, using numbers that were static so that they are somewhat structural for your adventure to move the direction you want it to go, while at the same time letting the players have their influence. Now, these numbers can be adjusted. For example, if the players brought gifts, they might have a higher affability rating than what was originally written. Or perhaps they are being challenged for their stance. They're not responding the way the players might like. Well, you can also check against their stability to see how long they'll hold out if they are tested. And that, of course, then leads to their determination value. But the idea here is that the communal attributes give you a fast way to get answers to questions for players without having to dig through all of your other pages and pages of lore to determine whether or not the local magistrate is a fink or whatever. All right, next. Okay. So the next things to happen when you're in town, you're going to be looking for information. And my groups, I can tell you, love the data collection process in the NycosRPG. Yes, it's always possible to hear scuttlebutt from a given location. But eavesdrop is such a specialized named skill that it feels sort of redundant to give players all the same roles. So one of the methods that I came up with for handling that is the idea that the skill name really tells you more about the skill than you might think. So, for example, one person might have a trimming the verge skill, similar to, let's say, Tolkienian short folk. The trimming of the verge means that not only are they good at overhearing, but it means in particular they can get close enough by mixing with the shrubbery. And so when it comes to gathering that information, one thing that the players will often ask for is, what is the likelihood of there being say, a rogues guild? So let me show you an example. Oops, that went the wrong one. Where did it go? I don't know where I put it. That's very funny. Well, we'll just go on to the next screen and find it there. All right. So under the general resource values, you'll see the general. This is from the master book, and so the names are a little bit odd. But if you're looking for investigators or spy or investigators or rangers or that kind of thing, or if you're looking for rogues guild, you would look under the sneaks, for example. And then you would have a numeric value, whether you chose it or ramped it, to see whether or not there's a particular sneak in a particular place at a particular time. Supports perhaps are people that are healers and such, talkers, tanks, tinkers. These are all general terms from the master book, but the values therefore are the likelihood of them finding somebody to meet a specific task without speaking of a particular persona. This gives you a little bit more room to expand your field of view, so to speak, by providing window dressing or perhaps a non-enjoined player, a non-enjoined persona that they need to interact with that isn't necessarily going to have an identity that they need to track. One of the biggest challenges in a good role-play game is you have lots and lots of NPCs to try to keep track of, but if every Tom, Dick, and Harry has a particular skill, then you could at least limit out all of the people they need to know. Now, here in the next section, we're going to talk about cultural estates. And if you know anything about the NycosRPG system, we speak of place and estates as separate elements. So culture and estates or motives are generally kept apart. But in this section, because the community or the location might be relatively small, you only have a few access points that you might want to list in terms of, for example, if you come into an isolated community and they happen to be pretty xenophobic, it's more than likely that there's some form of a cult, some sort of religious or social fanaticism. And so by having one or two or three of these specific cultural estates, they provide touch points for your players to harken back to their character development stage and decide whether or not they want to interact with that community on that basis. This isn't necessarily something that's used every session, but occasionally it's a big question of, well, is that religion available here? You can have a numeric value. Let me show you where that is on the form. So here in the midsection, the cultural estates, you would list whatever the two or three, whether they be cultures or organizational groups, the unions and guilds and such might be listed here. And that really would be those that would be significant enough to have influence, and therefore they would have a numeric value as well that you could check against. So if they're looking for a priest of a certain faith community, you can see whether or not that faith community exists, and if so, what their numeric values are. Now, these pages are also not just creative, but they're also adaptive, and we'll talk about that on the last screen. But just realize that it might be possible that you might have left a blank and didn't have any cultural estates listed, but the player has now asked a question, and so now you need to see whether or not it's even possible. And so you can add to these on the fly. Okay, the next are going to be occupations and trades. And this is not necessarily different in the case of, for example, Dungeons and Dragons or particular role-playing games, because those have very stratified identities in terms of your skills and such. But in this case, occupations and trades might be there is a taxidermy specialist, or as an example, or maybe you need a surgeon. And by having those particular occupations and trades listed on the form, then you're giving yourself the answers to those questions well in advance, so if the players happen to come across it, you'll have the fast answer for them from your tome. So let me show you where that's at. Boop. So here in the occupations and trades, you're going to write down what particular occupations you think the players might want to run into, or perhaps the one that they're asking about, and then you can even hold them off for a bit as you determine whether or not it's likely, whether you take some time and do a ramp or just decide on a numeric value. This gives you the opportunity to come off looking like a champ, because if they ask for, as I said, a taxidermist that works in a certain kind of animal, you can check against his now created numeric value and therefore look like a hero. Okay, so now we're going to come to the final portion of this, and that's the economic balance. Now it might seem backwards to build your story by individuals and then work backwards to nobility and all of that. But the economic balance mechanism in Nykos in particular is that you're talking about the instantaneous values of these things. And so having a clear economic balance isn't necessary at first, because the players don't even know who they want to meet. And so therefore it just will progress to logically looking for, let's say, a noble who's in command of the area or whatever. And so therefore on the TableTome, you'll have your economic balance, upper, middle, and lower classes. My recommendation is you roll a percentage on a ramp for the upper class, middle class, and then the remainder would be the low class. You could do it in reverse order if you wanted to emphasize, but you don't know what your number is going to ramp out to be. Now, you could also set these numbers the way you would want. If you're talking about the center of a cultural center, then you're going to have, moderately high upper class, and your body of the majority of your encounters will be in the middle classes, and then a small amount of lower class individuals. Or conversely, you might be in a established city-state which has an extremely high lower class and a moderate middle. And so therefore you can choose how you want that to go, creating therefore the opportunity to answer those ambiguous questions with more clarity, because you had it all in one place on your form. Now, I do want to mention that all of these numbers can advance or reduce over time based on what happens in your game. So if this location becomes a center point, then every interaction that the players have along one of these may influence them the same way that skills would influence a character. That is to say, if they come into town, the aesthetic appeal is rather moderate, but they decide to build a brand new building, then the automatic action of that built structure might be to increase the aesthetic appeal. So you would adjust these numbers roughly the same way you would a character sheet, with a modification of a numeric value only when it's interacted with. What I have found is that players want the community to feel alive, and one of the ways to do that is have these numbers ebb and flow with their uses. So, for example, if the adventurers very rarely go for trade and interaction with others, then perhaps the trade relevance of your locale might go down because the players become such a part of the community. On the other hand, if the adventurers decide to intermarry and be part of the local community, then your social integration and population density might significantly change by player interaction. Now, there is a third page that I always want to point out, and that is the Nycos system, as I mentioned before, has a matryoshka method. The idea is that you build each tier with the area around it already prepared for expansion. So if they've come in from the north, for example, then you'd have the community they came from listed south of the community because they came in, or I'm sorry, if they came in from the north, it'd be from the north. If they ask about what's to the west of town, have 2 or 3 perhaps locations that they might visit at some point in the future. And these can be as detailed or general as you would want. So it might be the Westlands, but it might also be the town of, Banbury. And so therefore, by having where these locations are compared to where they are, the players can have more of a feeling of depth built off of just your single tome. Without you having to have any of the documentations, you've now handled those kinds of questions that they might not have thought of or that you didn't think of before the session began, and yet you have everything you need at your fingertips. So as we head off to the parting shots, I just want to say thank you for being here for today's episode and to ask the questions. What do you feel are the benefits of a tool like this? Can you see how this would be helpful to your table? If there's any parts of this table that are inadequate or you'd like to recommend some others, I'm open to that as well. So leave some comments down below. Let us know how this works for you. Do give us some feedback if you download it. It's an absolutely free benefit of NycosRPG. I'll be adding more of them over the next year or so as I make the site more functional for those of you that play. For more information about NycosRPG, of course, check out our website, which was mentioned before, and it'll be in the comments below. I want to thank you again, and why don't we get together? Yeah, let's play.